Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. Tonight, we enter the world of Miss Marple in the puzzle in the lacemaker's testament, a hidden will, a tangled pattern, and a question of who dares profit from silence. Light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. The roses bloomed late that June in St. Mary Mead, and it was said with much nodding over teacups that the weather had conspired to delay the Women's Institute garden party. The event was a staple of the village calendar. An afternoon of sponge cakes, raffles, flower arrangements, and the inevitable gossip that fluttered more briskly than the bunting strung across the vicarage lawn. Among the elderly ladies in their hats and the younger mothers shepherding children sat Miss Jane Marple, quietly dabbing a drop of lemonade from her glove. She had chosen a shady corner beneath a yew tree, where she could observe the comings and goings with unobtrusive ease. It was a position that had served her well in life. People often forgot she was there, and in forgetting, spoke more freely. The centerpiece of the day was the lace-making demonstration, a skill still clung to by Mrs. Emmeline Price, a woman well into her 70s, whose gnarled hands still coaxed astonishing delicacy from bone bobbins and fine threads. Her table was laid with patterns, samples, and most prominently, an ornate lace shawl said to have been made for a viscountess. Mrs. Price, with her sharp features and sharper tongue, enjoyed telling anyone within earshot that lace-making was an art of patience and precision, qualities in short supply among the younger generation. The shawl was not the only object of fascination that afternoon. There was also Mrs. Price's testament, or rather the fact that she had been speaking of it too freely. It was whispered she had recently revised her will, and certain villagers had grown tense at the mere mention of it. She had no children, but she had a niece, a cousin or two, and a handful of hopeful acquaintances who had lent her favors over the years. When a woman of property, Mrs. Price, who owned a handsome cottage, a string of war bonds, and a collection of lace valued by collectors, began to speak of her final wishes, ears pricked up. It was into this hum of speculation that the vicar called for a hymn, an odd interlude at a garden party, but one Mrs. Price had insisted upon. The crowd dutifully joined in the refrain of All Things Bright and Beautiful, though the singing was half-hearted, and more than a few eyes strayed toward the sponge cakes. Miss Marple hummed softly, her eyes on Mrs. Price. The old lace-maker had been unusually restless all afternoon, fidgeting with her bobbins and snapping at the clumsy hands of her volunteer assistant. More than once she patted her reticule, a bulging little bag that seemed to weigh upon her mind. When the hymn ended, she raised her voice for all to hear. "I have it with me today," she declared, tapping the reticule. "The testament. And I'll tell you that those who think to flatter me into generosity will be sorely disappointed. I've left my things where they belong, not where they're wanted." The declaration was met with an awkward silence, broken by a nervous laugh from Mrs. Bartlett, who had long hoped for the lace shawl. But Mrs. Price would brook no softening of her words. She glared about her as though daring someone to object. It was Miss Marple who noted the reactions. The tightening of young Lydia Price's jaw, Lydia being the lace-maker's niece who lived with her in the cottage, the faint paling of Reverend Crispin, who had been promised a donation toward the new church roof, and the quick sideways glance of Mr. Harold Sims, the village solicitor, who had drawn up the document. Human nature was a study, Miss Marple often said, and today the textbook was open wide. The garden party continued in its slightly disjointed way, but an undercurrent had been set loose. People whispered in corners, speculation racing ahead of good manners. Then, just as the raffle tickets were being drawn, a commotion near the lace-making table silenced the chatter. Mrs. Price had collapsed, her hand clutching the reticule as though in final defense. A cry went up first for water, then for a doctor. Dr. Haydock, conveniently in attendance, hurried forward, but his examination was brief and his face grave. "She is gone," he said simply. The shawl, the bobbins, and the patterns all lay in delicate disarray, but it was the reticule that commanded attention. It had fallen open, revealing only a handkerchief, a small purse of coins, and a sprig of lavender. Of the much-spoken testament there was no sign. For a moment the crowd was struck dumb. Then the whispering began anew, sharper and more fevered than before. A will vanished and a woman died. Was it apoplexy, a weak heart, or something more sinister? Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting untouched in her lap. She had known Mrs. Price for many years, and could not recall the old lady ever being careless with her words. To brandish her will so publicly, to hint at secrets and disappointments, was to invite the darker impulses of human nature. And now, with the lacemaker's death sudden and unexplained, the question was not only who might benefit, but also who might have acted already. The village would not sleep easily that night. And Miss Marple, quietly watching from her shaded corner, already suspected that Mrs. Price's final testament, like her lace, had been woven with threads far more tangled than anyone realized. The death of Mrs. Emmeline Price cast a long shadow over St. Mary Mead, and like any shadow, it crept into every corner where villagers gathered to talk. By the following morning, the garden party had become the stuff of hushed retellings, each version more embroidered than the last. At the butcher's shop, Mrs. Bartlett declared with conviction that Mrs. Price had been struck down by her own temper. "It was the shock of clutching that wretched bag," she said, leaning over the counter as if confiding state secrets. The woman wound herself up to such a pitch she simply burst. Quite natural, really. Dr. Haydock will tell you the same, but in the post office, where facts rarely survived unscathed, Miss Hartnell was telling anyone within reach that the reticule had been rifled by unseen hands. Plain as day, I noticed it myself. One moment it was bulging, the next it was flat as a pancake. Somebody slipped that testament away before we'd even noticed. She pursed her lips with relish. Mark my words, there'll be questions about who inherits that cottage. Meanwhile, at the Blue Boar the men gathered with tankards of ale and shook their heads in solemn agreement that old Mrs. Price had simply been asking for it. Not death, of course, but trouble. The consensus was that she had a sharp tongue and a sharper pen, and the mere threat of disinheritance was enough to stir dangerous thoughts. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, could almost hear the collective rustle of rumour as clearly as the sparrows in her garden. It amused her in a quiet way to observe how each villager's theory revealed more about themselves than about the crime. For crime it was beginning to seem so, though no official pronouncement had yet been made. She recalled with precision born of habit the expressions on several faces at the party. Lydia Price, the niece, had turned pale at her aunt's announcement, and had looked not at her aunt but at the reticule. The Reverend Crispin had shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar as though already mourning the church roof. And Mr. Sims, the solicitor, had fixed his eyes on the grass, studiously avoiding anyone's gaze. All small signs, easily overlooked by those who preferred words to silences. By mid-afternoon the inquest had been scheduled for later in the week, but the speculation would not wait for formality. Miss Marple's maid, young Cherry, bustled in with more news than dusting completed. "They're saying," Cherry began breathlessly, "that Mrs. Price left everything to the niece. Everything. And if that's true, well, it'll be a wonder if Miss Lydia can step foot out of the cottage without someone calling her a murderer." Miss Marple, who never contradicted but only inquired, asked mildly, "And who is saying this, dear?" "Oh, Mrs. Bartlett told Mrs. Lumley, and Mrs. Lumley told Mr. Carter. And he said as much when he came in for his chops," Cherry rattled off. "And Mr. Carter heard it from someone who knows the solicitor's clerk, so it must be true." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "So very many steps for a simple piece of knowledge. Like a lace pattern, with each knot depending on the last. One wonders how the first thread was tied." Cherry looked puzzled, but Miss Marple let the remark dangle like an unfinished stitch. Later that evening, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Bantry, who had been positively itching to discuss the affair. In the drawing-room of Gossington Hall, with its wide windows and faint scent of lilac, Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "My dear Jane, did you ever see anything like it? To brandish her will in public. It's practically an invitation to mischief. And then to die so suddenly with the thing vanished. I declare it's straight out of one of those novels." Miss Marple nodded gently, her needles clicking. "Human nature, Dolly. People rarely think about how their words may settle in the minds of others. Seeds grow quickly in the right soil." Mrs. Bantry gave a little shiver. "You mean to say someone might have acted upon it? I mean only that I saw a good many seeds sown that afternoon," Miss Marple said quietly. The following day brought more excitement, for Inspector Slack himself arrived from Much Benham to take matters in hand. Slack was well known in St. Mary Mead for his brusque manner and his low opinion of amateur speculation. He listened with visible impatience to the overlapping accounts of villagers who insisted they had noticed this or that detail. "Half of you saw the bag snatched, and half of you saw it untouched," he barked at the crowd gathered outside the cottage. "You can't both be right. We'll sort fact from fancy soon enough." Inside the cottage, Lydia Price greeted the inspector with reddened eyes and a subdued manner. She was a young woman of perhaps 25, with plain features softened by an air of earnestness. She claimed her aunt had seemed in good health, though subject to spells of temper. The will, she insisted, had been sealed and placed in the reticule only the previous evening. "But where is it now, miss?" Inspector Slack demanded. Lydia faltered. "I don't know. It ought to have been there. It was all the encouragement the villagers needed." By nightfall, Lydia was the name whispered behind curtains, her every errand scrutinized. Miss Marple, who had strolled past the cottage at dusk, observed more quietly. She noted that Lydia carried herself with the stiffness of one who expects accusation at any moment, yet there was no trace of triumph in her expression, only bewilderment and something like fear. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. The pattern of talk in the village was already forming its loops and crossings, but like all lace, it required a steady eye to see where the thread truly began. She thought of Mrs. Price's declaration, of the reactions it provoked, of the missing document and of the sudden death. The village might rush to place the burden upon the niece, but Miss Marple, with her long experience, knew too well that the simplest explanation was rarely the truest. Still, she would say nothing. Not yet. There was enough time to listen, to observe, and to let people reveal more than they intended, for in St. Mary Mead, secrets never stayed buried long. They had a way of surfacing like threads tugged loose from an old lace pattern, betraying the entire design. The inquest had not yet been held, but Inspector Slack wasted no time in beginning his inquiries. To his way of thinking, sudden deaths with missing documents usually boiled down to the same tiresome thing: greed. If a testament had vanished, it was because someone wanted it gone, and if Mrs. Price had collapsed, it was likely someone had hastened her departure. By mid-morning, Slack was seen marching along the high street, his notebook clutched like a weapon, while the villagers craned their necks from windows and garden gates. He stopped first at the vicarage, where Reverend Crispin awaited him with an expression halfway between worry and righteous indignation. "Such a dreadful business, Inspector," the vicar said, ushering him into the parlour. Mrs. Price was a loyal supporter of the parish. She could be difficult, yes, but generous too when her mind was settled. "Why," he promised us, catching himself, clearing his throat. "That is to say, she always took an interest in the church roof fund." "Did she now?" Slack said dryly, pencil scratching. "And was that promise in writing?" The vicar reddened. "Well, no. But she hinted often that she intended a contribution. I cannot deny I hoped she had made it explicit in her will." Slack raised an eyebrow. "So you were expecting to benefit?" The vicar flushed deeper. "For the parish, Inspector, not for myself. You mustn't twist my words." But Slack was not listening. He jotted a note and closed the interview briskly, leaving the vicar to wring his hands at being suspected of worldly interest. Across the lane, Miss Marple sat in her garden, snipping faded rose heads with careful fingers. She had seen Slack enter the vicarage and exit again, and she imagined the conversation with a fair degree of accuracy. Human nature, after all, seldom varied. Promises of bequests had a way of planting expectations that sometimes grew into desperation. Later, at the cottage, Lydia Price was interviewed at length. She answered politely but without much spirit, her pale face drawn and her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "I knew my aunt was carrying the testament, and she admitted it. She told me so before we left for the garden party. I begged her not to flaunt it. She could be so dramatic when she chose, but she laughed at me. She liked to stir people up, you see. It gave her a sense of power. And where is it now?" Slack pressed. "I don't know. Truly, I don't." Lydia's voice trembled. "If it's missing, someone must have taken it when she collapsed." Slack snapped his notebook shut. "Or before. Or perhaps it never left this house." The words hung heavy in the cottage kitchen, with its scent of boiled cabbage and its worn linoleum floor. Lydia's hands twisted together in her lap, and Miss Marple, who happened to be present under the guise of delivering a basket of scones, noted the girl's distress. It was genuine enough, yet beneath it lay a quality harder to name, an uneasiness not quite accounted for by grief alone. Miss Marple spoke gently, her voice almost absent-minded. "It is curious, is it not, how things disappear in moments of confusion? I once recall poor Mrs. Finch losing her spectacles at a funeral. They were found 3 days later, tucked into the minister's hymn book. People rarely think about where their hands place things when they are upset." Lydia gave a faint smile, but Slack scowled. "We're not looking for spectacles, Miss Marple. We're looking for a will. And I dare say we'll find it soon enough, along with whoever wanted it hidden." Word of Slack's suspicions spread quickly. By evening, tongues were wagging that Lydia Price was under a cloud, though others hinted darkly that the vicar or even the solicitor might have reasons of their own. Mr. Harold Sims, for his part, became suddenly reticent, refusing to discuss the matter with anyone. That silence, naturally, was interpreted by villagers as a sure sign of guilt. Miss Marple, however, reserved judgment. She had observed Sims at the party, his eyes fixed firmly downward when Mrs. Price spoke. That was not guilt, in her estimation, but discomfort, the kind of discomfort a man feels when he is privy to knowledge he would rather not share. Solicitors, she reflected, carried more secrets than any chest with a lock. The next day brought Dr. Haydock to her cottage, ostensibly to check on her health, though in truth he was eager to discuss Mrs. Price's collapse. He was not a man to indulge in wild theories, but he admitted that the suddenness of it troubled him. She had no record of heart trouble, he said, sipping the tea Miss Marple set before him. Strong as an ox, really, despite her age. I should have expected her to go on another 10 years. There are poisons, of course, that mimic the look of a seizure. But I've no evidence, no grounds to say so officially. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. One remembers, Doctor, that in matters of sudden death, evidence is sometimes found less in the body than in the living. How people behave and how they speak or do not speak, these are often the true indicators. Dr. Haydock smiled wryly. That's your province, Miss Marple, not mine. I'll leave the subtleties of behavior to you. But I'll tell you frankly, I don't like the feel of this business. Neither did Miss Marple. She sat long after the doctor departed, knitting set aside, pondering the web of motives that was already emerging. There was Lydia, the natural heir whose dependence on her aunt had been both financial and emotional. There was the vicar, embarrassed by his own expectations. There was Mr. Sims, burdened with knowledge and keeping silent. And beyond them, there were other villagers who had courted Mrs. Price's favour in small ways, each hoping for a mention in her will. The testament, wherever it was, had the power to expose or to disappoint, and thus to make enemies. That evening, as the sun set behind the cottages and the first lamps were lit, in the windows, Miss Marple took a slow walk down the lane. She greeted Mrs. Bartlett, nodded to Miss Hartnell, and exchanged a few mild observations about the weather. All the while she listened not to the words themselves, but to the tone, to the eagerness with which each villager speculated, to the little triumph in some voices and the defensiveness in others. When she returned home, she murmured to herself, "It is like lace indeed. The pattern is not yet visible, but each twist and knot is forming. Soon enough, one will see where it leads," and with that, she resumed her knitting, needles clicking, in the quiet room, her mind weaving patterns of a different sort, patterns that might in time reveal a killer hiding among neighbours who thought themselves ordinary. By the third day after Mrs. Price's sudden death, the village had settled on a likely culprit, and it required very little prompting from Inspector Slack. Lydia Price, the unfortunate niece, had moved from being the subject of speculation to the central figure of whispered accusations. Wherever she went, the post office, the grocer's, or even the church, she was met with sidelong glances and hushed exchanges. It's always the one who stands to gain the most, Mrs. Bartlett told a gathering of women at the Women's Institute, as though quoting Holy Writ. Who else would benefit but the niece? Mark my words, she'll have that cottage and the lace in her hands before the year is out. Miss Hartnell, not to be outdone, leaned forward conspiratorially. But don't forget, the will has vanished. What if Lydia destroyed it to ensure her inheritance? People have done worse for less. The group nodded in solemn satisfaction at having settled the matter. To their minds, Lydia was guilty until proven otherwise, and perhaps even after that. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, called Lydia to the station at Much Benham for questioning. His manner was brusque, almost triumphant, as though he had merely to tie up a few loose ends. Lydia sat pale and stiff in the wooden chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "You admit the will was in your aunt's reticule that morning?" Slack said, his pencil tapping against his notebook. "Yes," Lydia answered softly. "She told me so herself. And you were with her almost constantly until she collapsed." "I was near her, yes. But so were many others. The whole village was there." Slack gave a snort. Yet somehow, between the garden party and the vicar's hymn, the will disappeared. "No one had a better opportunity than you. You lived with her. You knew her habits, and you were closest to her belongings. That's motive, means, and opportunity all in one neat bundle." Lydia lifted her chin, her voice trembling but firm. "I did not touch my aunt's will. I loved her, though she was not always kind. And if she left her property to others, I would not have begrudged it. Do you think I would kill her for a cottage?" Slack's eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't be the first." The interview ended with no confession, but Slack left it in no doubt to his sergeant that he regarded Lydia as the guilty party. "She's weak," he declared. "Weak and desperate. Mark me, we'll prove it before long." Miss Marple, hearing of the interrogation from Dr. Haydock later that afternoon, merely pursed her lips. The doctor was indignant, declaring that Slack had all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. "Poor girl," he muttered. "I don't say she's a saint, but she's grieving, and Slack hounds her as though she were a common thief. It doesn't sit right with me." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "People often believe what is easiest to believe, Doctor, and it is always easier to accuse the one who stands nearest. But in my experience, truth is seldom so obliging." That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at Mrs. Bantry's. Several villagers were present, and the subject of Mrs. Price dominated the conversation. Mrs. Bartlett repeated, with evident relish, her conviction that Lydia was guilty. The vicar, looking uncomfortable, urged restraint, while Miss Hartnell insisted that the missing will was proof enough. Miss Marple listened with her customary mild expression, interjecting only once when Mrs. Bartlett declared, "If Lydia did nothing wrong, how do you explain the missing testament?" "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "one does not always explain such things at once. Sometimes objects vanish because people put them away in curious places. Sometimes they vanish because others wish them gone. And sometimes, of course, they vanish only to reappear at the most inconvenient moment." Her words were met with blank stares, and Mrs. Bartlett sniffed. "Well, I say the girl's guilty." Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her eyes twinkling faintly. It was remarkable, she reflected, how villagers mistook certainty for truth. The following morning brought a new development. Mr. Sims, the solicitor, appeared unexpectedly at the cottage to speak with Lydia. Miss Marple, passing by on her way to the grocer, happened to see him at the door. He looked grave, and his conversation, though hushed, carried enough for her sharp ears to catch fragments. "Your aunt insisted on secrecy, revised the terms. Others may be disappointed." Lydia's reply was too soft to hear, but her expression was stricken. When Sims departed, Miss Marple saw that he avoided the gaze of every passer-by, his shoulders hunched as though shielding himself from questions. That evening, Lydia was seen walking the lanes alone, her face troubled, her eyes rimmed red. Some said it was guilt. Miss Marple, watching from her gate, thought otherwise. It was fear, plain and simple, the fear of one who knows suspicion is closing in, but has no defense that anyone will hear. Yet Miss Marple's mind did not rest on Lydia alone. She recalled the sharpness of Mrs. Price's words at the party, the defiance with which she had declared her will safe in her reticule. Such statements were calculated to wound as well as to protect. A woman like Mrs. Price, who had spent a lifetime measuring favors and slights, would never revise her will without leaving a trail of dissatisfaction. And dissatisfaction, Miss Marple knew, was fertile soil for darker impulses. The village might content itself with Lydia as the obvious suspect, and Inspector Slack might congratulate himself on progress. But Miss Marple, with her deep understanding of human nature, sensed that the pattern was only beginning to show itself. She resumed her knitting that night with quiet determination. In every lace pattern there were false starts, threads that led nowhere, and twists meant to deceive the eye. So it was with human behavior. And while the village might fix its gaze on the girl at the cottage, Miss Marple's eyes were upon the entire web. The inquest was set for the end of the week, and though Inspector Slack had all but declared Lydia Price guilty in private, he still lacked anything resembling proof. The missing will had not surfaced, no poison had yet been identified, and the evidence remained circumstantial. Still, the villagers of St. Mary Mead thrived on conjecture, and their stories grew ever more elaborate. Miss Marple, meanwhile, occupied herself in her usual fashion knitting, visiting neighbours, and listening with quiet attentiveness to every scrap of conversation that drifted her way. It was in these ordinary exchanges that truths, or fragments of truths, often revealed themselves. One morning, while calling at the vicarage to deliver some rose cuttings, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Crispin in the hallway. The vicar's wife, flustered and eager as always, could not resist sharing her latest concern. Miss Marple, meanwhile, occupied herself in her usual fashion knitting, visiting neighbours, and listening with quiet attentiveness to every scrap of conversation that drifted her way. It was in these ordinary exchanges that truths, or fragments of truths, often revealed themselves. One morning, while calling at the vicarage to deliver some rose cuttings, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Crispin in the hallway. The vicar's wife, flustered and eager as always, could not resist sharing her latest concern. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple, simply dreadful," she said, lowering her voice, though no one was near. "I hardly know how to console Lydia. The poor girl has everyone against her, and I dare say the inspector is determined to pin it on her. He asked my husband no fewer than 3 times whether Mrs. Price had ever promised money to the church. As though a clergyman would fabricate such a thing." Miss Marple smiled gently. "People often hear what they hope to hear, my dear. Promises may be spoken in haste and remembered quite differently." Mrs. Crispin sighed, pressing her hands together. "I only pray the will turns up, though heaven knows in whose favour it will be. It might clear the matter or make it worse." "Dreadful, Miss Marple, simply dreadful," she said, lowering her voice, though no one was near. "I hardly know how to console Lydia. The poor girl has everyone against her, and I dare say the inspector is determined to pin it on her. He asked my husband no fewer than 3 times whether Mrs. Price had ever promised money to the church. As though a clergyman would fabricate such a thing." Miss Marple smiled gently. "People often hear what they hope to hear, my dear. Promises may be spoken in haste and remembered quite differently." Mrs. Crispin sighed, pressing her hands together. "I only pray the will turns up, though heaven knows in whose favour it will be. It might clear the matter or make it worse." Miss Marple made a mild reply, but her mind was already turning. The will itself remained the linchpin of the mystery. It was not merely absent, it had vanished under the eyes of an entire gathering. Such vanishing acts, Miss Marple reflected, were seldom achieved without preparation. Later that afternoon, she strolled past the cottage where Lydia now lived alone. The curtains were drawn and the garden, usually neat, had begun to show signs of neglect. Lydia herself emerged carrying a small basket, and though she greeted Miss Marple politely, her expression was troubled. "They all think it was me," she said suddenly, as if the words had been bottled too long. "No matter what I say, they won't believe me." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "People are quick to judge, my dear, but truth is not always in the loudest voices. Sometimes it hides in the smallest places." Lydia gave her a faint, puzzled smile before hurrying away. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly recalling every detail of the garden party. The shawl was displayed upon the table, the bobbins clattering as Mrs. Price worked, and the reticule rested always at her side. She pictured again the moment of collapse, the sudden cry, the rush of people, and the confusion. Objects were moved then hastily, without thought. A handkerchief and a sprig of lavender had been found in the reticule, but what of the lavender? Miss Marple frowned slightly, her needles pausing mid-stitch. Lavender was not a usual possession of Mrs. Price. She had favoured peppermint lozenges and camphor sachets, but lavender sprigs. Someone had placed it there, either before or after the collapse, and in so doing, they might have unwittingly revealed themselves. The next day, Miss Marple mentioned the lavender casually while visiting Mrs. Bantry. Such a charming touch, don't you think? Though curious, Emily never cared for lavender. She used to say it gave her headaches. Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Why, that's true. I remember her refusing a lavender pillow at the fete last year. She was quite sharp about it, too. Said she wouldn't have the stuff in her house." Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild. So odd, then, that it should be found in her reticule. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You don't suppose? I suppose only that people often leave traces of themselves where they least intend, Miss Marple said softly. Meanwhile, Inspector Slack pursued his own line, though with far less subtlety. He summoned Harold Sims, the solicitor, to account for his knowledge of the will. Sims, perspiring heavily, admitted that Mrs. Price had revised it only days before her death. She instructed me to keep the terms confidential, he said nervously. I drafted it, and she collected it herself. Beyond that I cannot say. Slack leaned forward. And who did she name as her heir? Sims shook his head. I cannot reveal that without the document itself. Solicitor's duty, Inspector, Slack growled. But Miss Marple, hearing of the exchange later, thought it telling. Sims had avoided more than legal obligation. He had avoided personal entanglement. That avoidance itself was a thread to be noted. That evening, as dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window reflecting. The lavender spring troubled her. It was a small thing, so small that Inspector Slack had dismissed it as of no importance. Yet Miss Marple knew from long experience that the smallest things often mattered most. She remembered once, years ago, a village quarrel that ended in disgrace. It had all hinged on a button left in the wrong sewing basket, a button so trivial no one else had thought to question it. And here again, perhaps, was such a clue, an out-of-place spring, hinting at a hand that had touched the reticule when it ought not to have done so. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the quiet room. A pattern was forming, faint but discernible, and she intended to follow it wherever it led, for the truth, she knew, was woven not in great gestures, but in the tiniest of threads. The lavender clue lingered in Miss Marple's mind, but she told no one of her suspicions. Instead, she let the village unravel itself as it always did when scandal brushed against its quiet lanes. People revealed more in defense of their innocence than they ever did in confession. And Miss Marple listened, knitting needles clicking with deceptive idleness. The inquest loomed closer, and tension in St. Mary Mead grew heavier with each passing day. Lydia Price bore the weight of suspicion in silence, venturing out only when necessary, her head bowed under the scrutiny of neighbors. Even Cherry, Miss Marple's maid, admitted to feeling uneasy. I saw her in the lane, miss, Cherry whispered one morning while dusting the mantel. She looked as pale as a ghost. I almost felt sorry for her. But then I thought, what if she really did it? It makes me shiver. Miss Marple replied gently, Fear is often mistaken for guilt, my dear. One must learn to tell the difference. Meanwhile, Inspector Slack pressed harder. He was determined to extract something useful from Harold Sims, the solicitor, whose reluctance only sharpened the inspector's suspicion. Slack cornered him in his office, demanding once again to know the terms of the missing testament. Sims dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. Inspector, I am bound by professional duty, but I will say this. Mrs. Price was not a woman to forgive slights. Her bequests reflected her feelings, and not all of them were generous. Slack's pencil flew across the page. Names, Mr. Sims, who stood to lose? But Sims shook his head. I can say no more. If the will is recovered, all will be clear. Word of this interview inevitably spread through the village, carried from the solicitor's clerk to the grocer, and from the grocer to half a dozen housewives. Before evening, it was firmly believed that Mrs. Price had disinherited several people. Though who those people were remains a matter of debate. Miss Marple, attending her weekly knitting circle, listened as Mrs. Bartlett declared with relish, I shouldn't be surprised if the vicar was left out altogether. She could be vindictive when she liked, and perhaps she cut out poor Lydia as well. That would explain why the girl snatched it. Mrs. Lumley shook her head. No. I heard from Mrs. Sims's cousin that the will favoured Lydia but left something to others too. The solicitor is hiding it because he doesn't want to take sides. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her expression mild. She knew that gossip, like lace, created elaborate patterns of its own, but rarely did it produce anything resembling the truth. It was not only gossip that stirred unease. Confrontations, subtle and otherwise, began to break through the surface calm. One evening Lydia was overheard in sharp words with the Reverend Crispin just outside the church. You know very well she promised money to the roof fund, Crispin said, his voice tight. And you know very well she threatened to revoke it only last month, Lydia shot back, her voice trembling. If you were counting on my aunt's favor, then perhaps you had better look to yourself before you point at me. The exchange was repeated by 3 different witnesses, each with slight variations, but the gist remained. Lydia was no longer the only figure under suspicion. The Reverend's dignity had been pricked, and whispers spread that perhaps his interest in the will was not so holy after all. Around the same time, Mrs. Bantry confided in Miss Marple over tea that she had noticed another peculiar detail at the party. It struck me at the time, Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice, that Miss Hartnell was far too attentive to Mrs. Price's reticule. I distinctly recall her eyes following it almost hungrily. She made some remark about how heavy it looked, and I thought it odd. I didn't think much of it then, but now Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. People do notice objects when they believe something within may concern them. Curiosity is a natural instinct, though it can sometimes betray deeper motives. As these secrets surfaced, Miss Marple pieced together the threads. The lavender in the reticule, the solicitor's unease, the Reverend's sharp exchange, and Miss Hartnell's attention, all these small signs hinted at a web of motives wider than Inspector Slack had yet considered. Still, she kept her counsel. To speak too soon was to risk alerting the guilty, and Miss Marple knew the value of patience. The turning point came one afternoon when Lydia, desperate to clear her name, sought Miss Marple's advice. She arrived at the cottage pale and drawn, clutching her hands together. "Miss Marple, I don't know what to do. They all think I destroyed the will. Inspector Slack all but said so, but I swear I never touched it." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "My dear, innocence is seldom proved by words alone. It is in what others reveal of themselves that truth emerges. Tell me, who had reason to dislike your aunt most strongly in recent months?" Lydia hesitated. "Many, I suppose. She quarreled with nearly everyone." But she faltered. There was talk of her selling the lace collection. Some people felt cheated, as though she had promised it to them. And she had threatened to cut off donations she had once promised. She liked to dangle such things over people. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Yes, power, when exercised through promises, is a dangerous thing. It makes enemies of friends and liars of those who hope. Lydia burst into tears. "Then what hope is there for me?" Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Hope lies in patience. People reveal themselves under pressure. Already they quarrel among themselves. The truth will come, my dear. It always does." That night, as Miss Marple sat by her lamp, knitting laid aside, she reflected on the pattern taking shape. Secrets were surfacing. Sharp words were exchanged, and suspicion was widening like ripples in a pond. Somewhere among those ripples was the hand that had guided Mrs. Price's final moments. The sprig of lavender, so out of place, remained foremost in her mind. For in that small detail she suspected lay the mark of the true culprit, though who among the villagers would claim it, and why, was not yet clear. The village was restless, the air thick with unease. And Miss Marple, with her sharp eye for the ways of human nature, knew the storm was only beginning. By the end of the week, the village of St. Mary Mead had reached a fever pitch of gossip. Each new rumor seemed to take on a life of its own, weaving into the narrative like another knot in a lace pattern. Inspector Slack, irritated by the endless chatter, insisted he was closing in on the culprit. But in truth, his investigation remained stalled. The missing will had not surfaced. The doctor had provided no conclusive evidence of poison, and Lydia Price's quiet insistence on her innocence continued to trouble even those most eager to condemn her. It was on a damp, grey afternoon that the twist arrived. Young Tommy Carter, son of the grocer, came racing down the high street with the breathless urgency of a boy who had found something too exciting to keep secret. In his hand, tightly clutched, was a folded piece of paper. By the time he reached the post office, half the village had gathered around him. "I found it," he declared, cheeks flushed. "In the hedge by the vicarage. A will, Mrs. Price's will." The announcement spread like wildfire. Within minutes, Inspector Slack was summoned, and the boy was brought to the station with his discovery. The document, once examined, appeared genuine enough. Stamped with Sims's office seal, signed by Mrs. Price, and witnessed by 2 neighbors. Slack's face lit with triumph. "There you are, proof at last. Someone tried to dispose of it, but it didn't get far." The terms of the will were soon known. Nothing remained secret in St. Mary Mead for long. Lydia was indeed the principal heir, inheriting the cottage, the lace, and the greater part of Mrs. Price's savings. The Reverend Crispin was granted a modest sum for the church roof, and several small bequests were scattered among friends and acquaintances. Notably absent, however, were Mrs. Bartlett and Miss Hartnell, both of whom had long considered themselves favourites. The discovery caused an uproar. For some, it confirmed Lydia's guilt. "There you have it," Mrs. Bartlett declared to anyone who would listen. She knew she was to inherit everything, so she made certain of it. Dropped the will when she panicked. That's how it ended up in the hedge. Miss Hartnell, meanwhile, bristled with indignation. "I won't believe it. That woman promised me her lace shawl. I was confident in her. This so-called will must have been altered." At the cottage, Lydia's reaction was one of despair. Though the will named her as heir, it did nothing to clear her name. If anything, suspicion clung more tightly. "I told them I never touched it," she whispered to Miss Marple, tears in her eyes. "But now with this, they'll never believe me. They'll say I tried to destroy it and failed." Miss Marple, who had accompanied Lydia when the inspector arrived to inform her of the terms, observed quietly. The will, she thought, was too convenient in its discovery. A child stumbling upon it in a hedge? That smacked of orchestration. Such documents did not simply flutter into the shrubbery like lost letters. Later, Miss Marple confided her thoughts to Mrs. Bantry. "It is very curious. Dolly, if someone wished to rid themselves of the will, why leave it so near the scene? Why not burn it, or bury it, or cast it into the river? A hedge is a most unreliable hiding place. One is almost tempted to believe it was meant to be found." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You mean someone planted it there?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People often go to great lengths to appear innocent. Sometimes the cleverest deception is to leave evidence where it will be discovered so as to direct suspicion upon another." The twist set the village abuzz once more. Miss Hartnell confronted Lydia openly outside the grocer's. "So you get everything, do you? And the rest of us nothing?" "I don't believe a word of it. You or that sly solicitor cooked it up between you." Lydia, trembling, fled down the lane, pursued by whispers and stares. Meanwhile, Inspector Slack crowed that the case was all but solved. "The motives plain, the opportunity obvious, and now we've got the testament. What more could you ask?" Dr. Haydock, however, remained uneasy. He called upon Miss Marple that evening, confessing his doubts. "I don't like it, Jane. The cause of death is still uncertain, and this business with the will feels contrived. I've seen sudden deaths, but this one nags at me, and now the will appears as if by magic." "It's too tidy," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Yes, Doctor. Tidy arrangements are rarely natural. Life, in my experience, is seldom so obliging." As the rain pattered against her window later that night, Miss Marple considered the matter deeply. The lavender spring, the solicitor's reluctance, the Reverend's quarrel, and now the miraculous discovery of the will, all pieces of a pattern that was becoming more intricate. If the will had been meant to vanish, its reappearance suggested a change of plan. Perhaps the culprit, fearing discovery, had chosen instead to redirect suspicion. And who better to cast it upon than the already beleaguered niece? Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully and set it aside. The case was no longer merely about a missing document or a quarrelsome old woman's death. It was about deception, layered, deliberate, and dangerous. And in St. Mary Mead, deception never went unnoticed for long. Sooner or later, the pattern revealed itself, and Miss Marple was watching it form with patient, steady eyes. The reappearance of Mrs. Price's will had done little to calm the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead. If anything, the village had grown more restless. Lydia remained under suspicion. The solicitor was whispered about for his evasiveness, and the Reverend Crispin avoided eyes in the street, as though fearing to see his own guilt reflected back at him. Inspector Slack strutted about with renewed confidence, declaring that the case was as good as solved. Yet the villagers, though they nodded, did not quite believe him. There was a faint sense that matters were too neat, too quickly resolved. It was in this atmosphere that Miss Marple began her quiet testing method she had perfected over many years of observing human nature. She began with the Reverend Crispin. Encountering him one morning outside the church, she paused to admire the new scaffolding erected for repairs to the roof. "Such a blessing," she said gently, "that your late parishioner remembered the church in her will." A modest sum, perhaps, but still a token of her esteem. The Reverend's expression tightened, a flicker too fast for most to notice. Yes, yes, quite so. Generous of her. Though I confess I had hoped well, never mind. Miss Marple looked at him with mild surprise. It is often so disappointing when expectations exceed reality. I recall poor Mrs. Finch once thought herself the chief legatee of her cousin, only to discover she had been left nothing but a birdcage. Such shocks can be most distressing. The Reverend gave a forced smile and excused himself hastily, leaving Miss Marple to file away the moment. Disappointment, she reflected, could breed bitterness. Later that afternoon, she turned her attention to Miss Hartnell. She found her at the Women's Institute, fussing over a tray of seed catalogues. "Dear me, Miss Hartnell," Miss Marple remarked, "how very unlucky that you were left out of Mrs. Price's will. I should have thought she would remember your long acquaintance." Miss Hartnell bristled at once. "We were very close. She promised me that shawl, and I shall never believe otherwise." That solicitor must have twisted things, or perhaps Lydia persuaded her. I knew Emmeline Price. She would never willingly cut me out. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved serenely. "Promises, my dear, are so easily spoken, particularly by those who enjoy keeping others in suspense. One might even call it a little cruel." Miss Hartnell flushed and muttered something about justice, but her hands trembled as she stacked the catalogues. Next, Miss Marple called upon Harold Sims. She carried a tin of shortbread as an excuse, and sat primly in his stuffy little office while he poured tea with shaking hands. "Such a heavy burden for you, Mr. Sims," she murmured kindly, "to be caught between duty to your client and the curiosity of the whole village, and then for the will to appear in a hedge of all places. So strange, don't you think? Such documents are usually better guarded." Sims dabbed at his brow. "I cannot account for it, Miss Marple. I delivered it to Mrs. Price exactly as she requested. How it came to be there, well, I can only assume she misplaced it or that someone else intervened." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I once knew a case," she said conversationally, "where a gentleman threw his will into the fire to prevent his relatives from quarrelling. Unfortunately, it only caused them to quarrel more. People rarely consider how their actions ripple outwards." Sims gave a nervous laugh, but his eyes avoided hers. That avoidance, Miss Marple noted, was most telling. Finally, she spoke again with Lydia. The girl, pale and anxious, seemed almost afraid to meet Miss Marple's gaze. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "you mustn't despair. The truth has a way of revealing itself. But I wonder, did you notice anything unusual at the party? Anything small? Something you may not have thought important?" Lydia hesitated, twisting her hands. "There was one thing. I thought I saw Miss Hartnell lean very close to my aunt's bag just before the hymn. But then someone laughed and I looked away. When I turned back, my aunt was already clutching it again." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "How interesting. One must never dismiss such glimpses. They are often more revealing than long observations." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, reviewing the day's encounters. Each person had revealed something, not in confession but in reaction. The Reverend's disappointment, Miss Hartnell's indignation, and Sims's evasions were all threads in the place of the mystery, and still there was the lavender. That small, delicate sprig, tucked where it ought not to have been. Lavender was no friend of Mrs. Price, but perhaps it was a habit of another. Miss Marple recalled more than one villager who used lavender to scent drawers or to freshen rooms. It was a simple thing, easily overlooked, yet as distinctive as a fingerprint. The challenge, she thought, was to bring the truth to light without alarming the guilty too soon. A direct accusation would serve no purpose, but a gentle test, a chance remark, might prompt the very reaction she needed. People, when nudged by suggestion, often betrayed themselves. As the clock ticked softly in her cottage, Miss Marple prepared her next move. She would cast out a thread, as a lacemaker sets a bobbin, and watch carefully to see which hands reached for it. For in St. Mary Mead, the quietest words could prove deadliest, and Miss Marple knew well how to weave them. The days following Miss Marple's quiet probes were filled with restless energy. St. Mary Mead seemed unsettled, as though the village itself were waiting for something to break. The air grew heavy with suspicion, and every encounter seemed charged with hidden meaning. People who had once exchanged pleasantries now regarded each other with narrowed eyes, and the death of Mrs. Price became the only subject worth speaking of. Inspector Slack still proclaimed his certainty that Lydia Price was guilty, but fewer villagers echoed his confidence. Doubts had begun to creep in, seeded by small observations, whispered exchanges, and the curious reappearance of the will in the hedge. Mrs. Bantry remarked to Miss Marple one morning over tea, "It's all too neat, Jane. Lydia may be timid and frightened, but she's not cunning. She wouldn't have had the cleverness to plant that where it could be found." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, Dolly. Neatness often suggests arrangement, and arrangement suggests intention. It is not the mark of the timid, but of the calculating." Meanwhile, tension spilled over into sharper quarrels. At the post office, Miss Hartnell confronted Harold Sims with uncharacteristic boldness. "You knew," she accused, her voice rising above the shuffle of letters and the clink of coins. "You knew she meant to cut me out, and you said nothing. You let me believe otherwise." Sims flushed crimson, stammering, "It was not my place to reveal her intentions, madam. My duty was to the client, not to her acquaintances." "Acquaintances?" Miss Hartnell snapped. "We were friends for 40 years, and now I'm made a fool of thanks to you." The confrontation left Sims shaken, and word of it spread rapidly. By evening, the solicitor was spoken of as though he carried as much guilt as Lydia herself. Lydia, for her part, remained withdrawn, avoiding public places. But Miss Marple noted her silence was less the stubbornness of the guilty and more the resignation of the accused, who sees no hope of justice. It stirred in Miss Marple a quiet resolve, for she had seen too many innocents condemned by appearances. The Reverend Crispin, too, showed signs of strain. His sermons grew agitated, filled with pointed warnings about avarice and falsehood. Parishioners whispered that his conscience was troubling him, that perhaps he had expected too much from Mrs. Price's estate. His wife, a poor woman, grew visibly anxious, fluttering about with distracted chatter, as if hoping to drown out her husband's unease. Miss Marple, moving gently among them all, dropped her remarks like crumbs for sparrows. A casual word about the will here, an innocent observation about lavender there, always spoken in her mild, almost dithering tone. She knew how people underestimated her, and she relied upon it. Reactions mattered more than answers. It was during one of these small conversations that a telling moment came. At the Women's Institute, while examining lace samples, Miss Marple remarked aloud, "So curious that the will should be found in a hedge. One would think, if someone wished to rid themselves of it, they might burn it. After all, lace burns quickly, and paper too." At once Miss Hartnell's eyes flashed, and she said sharply, "Burning leaves traces. Smoke, ashes, things that can be noticed. A hedge now, a hedge is quite ordinary. Who pays heed to what lies in a hedge?" The words hung in the air, and a silence followed. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though she said nothing more. Later, she tucked that remark into her growing store of observations. Sometimes people revealed more in defending an idea than they realized. That evening, Dr. Haydock called again, his manner grim. "Slack still won't hear of poison," he told Miss Marple. "But I've reviewed her symptoms, and I can't dismiss it. Sudden seizure, quick collapse, it could have been digitalis or something similar. Of course, without direct evidence, my hands are tied." Miss Marple nodded. "Evidence, Doctor, is often found not in bottles or powders, but in actions and words. I believe the guilty hand will soon betray itself. The storm she spoke of came sooner than expected." On the following day, a second incident rattled the village. Mrs. Bantry, returning from a call at the Crispins' vicarage, noticed a peculiar smell in the Lanier sharp herbal scent that lingered unnaturally. She mentioned it in passing when she stopped at Miss Marple's cottage. "It struck me at once, Jane. Lavender, strong and unmistakable. Someone must have dropped a sachet, though I couldn't see one." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Lavender, you say? How curious. It does seem to follow us about, does it not?" The spring in the reticule and the sudden whiff in the lane were no coincidence. Miss Marple's thoughts settled like a bird upon a perch. Lavender was not merely decoration, it was a signature. The next morning she took a deliberate step. Inviting Mrs. Bantry, Lydia, and the Reverend's wife for tea, she contrived to have both Miss Hartnell and Harold Sims join them, under the pretense of discussing a charitable subscription. The gathering was cordial on the surface, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of tension. Miss Marple, all mildness and gentle chatter, guided the conversation toward Mrs. Price, So difficult, she sighed, when wills cause such strife. I remember when poor Mr. Tompkins left his estate to a distant cousin, and the neighbours quarrelled for years. One never knows where resentment may spring. Miss Hartnell sniffed loudly. Resentment? I dare say I feel some. To be promised a shawl and then cut out entirely is beyond decency. Sims shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eye. Lydia sat silent, her hands clenched in her lap. Mrs. Crispin fluttered helplessly, while Mrs. Bantry cast keen glances at them all. Miss Marple watched every flicker, every pause, her mind knitting the strands together. Human nature, she knew, always showed itself when pressure mounted, and here in her own little sitting room, pressure was quietly building. When the guest departed, Miss Marple remained by the window, her eyes on the lane where lavender grew wild along the hedges. She knew the pattern was nearly complete. Only one or two knots remained untangled, and soon, very soon, the truth would come to light. The evening after her quiet gathering, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, her knitting lying untouched in her lap. Outside, a thin mist drifted over the village, softening the outlines of cottages and hedgerows, as though the whole of St. Mary Mead was holding its breath. The time she knew had come. The pattern of the lace was visible now, and though some loops and twists remained subtle, the design was clear to her. The next morning, she sent word to Inspector Slack, requesting a private audience. Slack, though often dismissive of Miss Marple, had learned grudgingly that her observations could not be discounted. He arrived at her cottage with a notebook, a heavy step and an expression of impatience. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, settling stiffly into a chair, "you asked for me. I trust you've something useful to add. We've already got the niece tied to this as neatly as a parcel string." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice remained mild. "It is just that, Inspector, which troubles me. Neatness is a thing seldom found in real life. When matters arrange themselves too conveniently, one must ask whose hand tied the string." Slack gave a grunt but opened his notebook. "Go on, then." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "You will recall the sprig of lavender in Mrs. Price's reticule. A small thing, easily overlooked. But Mrs. Price detested lavender, and she said it gave her headaches. That lavender did not belong to her. It belonged to someone else, someone who handled the bag when they ought not to have done so." Slack frowned. "Plenty of people keep lavender about. Half the village put sachets in their drawers." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "But one must consider who is never without it. Mrs. Bantry mentioned smelling lavender in the lane only a day ago, though no sachet was found. And I recall years ago that Miss Hartnell was known for tucking lavender into her gloves, her handbag, and even her hymn book. She says it steadies her nerves. A habit, you see, is as telling as a signature." Slack blinked, his pencil pausing. "Are you saying Miss Hartnell stole the will?" "I am saying she handled the reticule," Miss Marple corrected gently. "The lavender betrays her touch. And then consider her words at the Women's Institute, when I suggested burning the will. She objected at once, too quickly, too sharply. She spoke as one who had thought about methods of disposal, and chose one she believed was clever to place it in a hedge, ordinary enough to escape notice, but certain to be found in time." Slack's brow furrowed. "That's supposition. Human nature, Inspector, is often more reliable than supposition," Miss Marple replied calmly. Miss Hartnell had long expected to inherit Mrs. Price's lace shawl. She felt certain of it, and had spoken of it often. To discover otherwise would have been a humiliation she could not bear. And Mrs. Price, with her sharp tongue, delighted in humiliating those around her. At the garden party, she made her declaration. Her will was with her, and certain people would be disappointed. Miss Hartnell, overhearing, realized she had been cut out. Slack tapped his pencil. So she took it. And more than that, Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Price's death was no natural seizure. Dr. Haydock was right to suspect poison. A simple infusion perhaps slipped into her lemonade. Not difficult for a woman of domestic habits, skilled with herbs. Lavender masks bitterness remarkably well, and Miss Hartnell, I believe, knew as much. For a long moment the inspector stared at her. Then he let out a slow breath. "You're telling me it wasn't Lydia at all. It was Hartnell." "For a shawl. And more than that," Miss Marple said softly. "Mrs. Price's death was no natural seizure. Dr. Haydock was right to suspect poison. A simple infusion perhaps slipped into her lemonade. Not difficult for a woman of domestic habits, skilled with herbs. Lavender masks bitterness remarkably well, and Miss Hartnell, I believe, knew as much. For a long moment the inspector stared at her. Then he let out a slow breath. "You're telling me it wasn't Lydia at all?" "It was Hartnell." "For a shawl, for more than a shawl," Miss Marple corrected. "For pride. For wounded vanity. People kill for such things more often than you might think." The lacemaker's testament was a web of promises and disappointments. Miss Hartnell, once she understood she was excluded, chose to act. She poisoned Mrs. Price, took the will, and planted it where it would be found later, hoping suspicion would fall upon Lydia, who seemed the obvious heir. Slack rubbed his chin, unwilling but unable to dismiss it. "You'll need more than that to convince a jury." Miss Marple's expression softened. "I dare say Miss Hartnell will provide it herself. A little pressure, a little suggestion, and she will tangle herself in her own threads. Pride resents silence, Inspector, and guilt cannot bear stillness. You will find she cannot resist protesting her innocence too loudly, and in doing so she will reveal her guilt." "Then a shawl," Miss Marple corrected. "For pride. For wounded vanity. People kill for such things more often than you might think." The lacemaker's testament was a web of promises and disappointments. Miss Hartnell, once she understood she was excluded, chose to act. She poisoned Mrs. Price, took the will, and planted it where it would be found later, hoping suspicion would fall upon Lydia, who seemed the obvious heir. Slack rubbed his chin, unwilling but unable to dismiss it. "You'll need more than that to convince a jury." Miss Marple's expression softened. "I dare say Miss Hartnell will provide it herself. A little pressure, a little suggestion, and she will tangle herself in her own threads. Pride resents silence, Inspector, and guilt cannot bear stillness. You will find she cannot resist protesting her innocence too loudly, and in doing so she will reveal her guilt." Later that day, Slack arranged for a formal interview at the station. Miss Hartnell, affronted at being summoned, arrived bristling with indignation. She denied everything, but her voice trembled when the inspector casually mentioned lavender. When Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner, remarked in her gentle way, "So like you, my dear, to always carry a spring. One remembers you had it even at Mrs. Price's party," Miss Hartnell faltered, her face draining of colour. It was only a moment, but it was enough. The inspector leaned forward sharply. "You see, Miss Hartnell, sometimes the smallest details speak loudest, and sometimes they speak louder than words." The room fell silent, the air heavy with realization. Miss Marple folded her hands serenely in her lap. The lace pattern was complete, but though the truth had been revealed, Miss Marple knew the village would take time to accept it. Gossip would shift, blame would be reassigned, and hearts would harden. For in St. Mary Mead, as everywhere, human nature was the same, flawed, hopeful, envious, and sometimes fatally prideful. And in the quiet that followed, Miss Marple thought once more of Mrs. Price's lace. Delicate, intricate, beautiful, and deadly when one pulled the wrong thread. The days after Miss Hartnell's faltering confession were marked by a strange quiet in St. Mary Mead. The village, which had for weeks thrummed with gossip and speculation, now moved more cautiously, as though ashamed of its own eagerness to condemn. People lowered their voices when speaking of Lydia, and eyes that once judged her harshly now looked away with a trace of embarrassment. Inspector Slack had secured his culprit, though not without grumbling that Miss Marple had done the real work. He told anyone who asked that Miss Hartnell's behaviour at the station, coupled with her possession of certain herbs and tinctures in her pantry, would be enough to put the matter before a magistrate. A bottle of dried foxglove leaves, tucked behind a row of lavender sachets, was all the proof he needed. But though the machinery of justice began its work, the heart of the village remained unsettled. Miss Hartnell had lived among them for decades. She had attended fêtes, embroidered altar cloths, scolded children, and scowled at newcomers. To think that she had harboured a darkness strong enough to kill for wounded pride was not easy to accept. At the post office, Mrs. Bartlett whispered to Mrs. Lumley, "I never liked her temper, mind you, but murder. I wouldn't have believed it." Mrs. Lumley pursed her lips. "One never knows. Still waters may run deep, but it is the shallow ones that splash the most mud." Miss Hartnell splashed often enough. Meanwhile, Lydia Price remained withdrawn, the shadow of suspicion slow to lift. Though the village now pitied her, Pity carried its own burden. People avoided her in the lanes, as if uncertain how to meet her eyes after weeks of whispered accusation. It was Miss Marple who visited her most faithfully, carrying small comforts of tea and scones, and reminding her gently that storms, however fierce, always pass. "You mustn't let bitterness grow, my dear," Miss Marple told her one afternoon, as they sat together in the neglected garden of the cottage. "It is very easy, when wronged, to let resentment take root. But resentment, you see, is much like foxglove, attractive, even useful, but dangerous if one lets it spread unchecked." Lydia gave her a faint smile. "I shall try, Miss Marple. I only wish they had believed me sooner. They will remember in time that they were too quick to judge," Miss Marple said softly. "But whether they admit it or not is another matter. People are not always brave in their regrets. The Reverend Crispin, too, bore his own measure of humiliation. His sharp sermons had been noted, and his eagerness for a bequest now seemed unseemly. He carried himself with stiff dignity, but his wife's nervous chatter betrayed the unease that lingered in their household. The small sum for the church roof was eventually received, but no one could forget how nearly it had been tainted by suspicion. As for Harold Sims, the solicitor, he regained some measure of respect, once it was clear he had been merely the keeper of Mrs. Price's secrets, rather than their manipulator. Still, villagers muttered that his nervous manner had done him no favours. He too would remain a figure of faint distrust, though nothing like the disgrace that had fallen upon Miss Hartnell. Miss Bantry, ever eager to reflect upon events, visited Miss Marple a week after the arrest. They sat together in the sunny sitting-room, with the sound of sparrows in the hedges outside. "My dear Jane, you were right all along." It was in the little things, the lavender, the way she spoke. "I should have seen it, but I never think of such details. How do you manage it?" Miss Marple smiled, her hands folded neatly over her knitting. "One notices, Dolly, that people are very much alike in their follies. I have seen women betrayed by pride in small matters, a cake competition, a parish quarrel, a borrowed hat. Human nature does not change with the scale of the offence. One only has to look and listen." Mrs. Bantry shook her head in admiration. "And all this because of a lace-maker's testament. Ah, but lace is very instructive," Miss Marple mused. "Each thread depends upon the others. A pattern emerges not from one piece alone, but from the whole. So it is with life. Mrs. Price wove her own pattern of promises and disappointments, and in the end, it was the tightening of one thread too many that caused the design to tear. Outside, the mist had lifted, and the village looked deceptively peaceful again. Children played in the lanes, and the shops carried on their business as before. Yet beneath the calm lingered a sense of unease, as though the air itself remembered the crime. Miss Marple, however, felt no unease. She had seen too much of human nature to be surprised. Pride, envy, vanity, and resentment were the common weeds of every village garden. Sometimes they grew unchecked, and sometimes, when given just the right soil, they proved deadly. That evening, she resumed her knitting with quiet satisfaction, the click of her needles steady in the fading light. Another mystery had been resolved, another truth brought gently to the surface. For those who knew Miss Marple best, there was comfort in the knowledge that while the world might hide its darkness beneath lace and lavender, she would always be there, quiet, observant, and unyielding, ready to untangle the pattern when no one else could. And so, St. Mary Mead returned to its routines, though with shadows lingering at the edges. Life went on as it always does, yet the villagers would remember the lacemaker's testament and the pride that had turned deadly in their midst. Miss Marple, gazing out at her garden as twilight fell, thought only this, that people, in their kindnesses and their cruelties, their promises and their betrayals, were endlessly fascinating. And though human nature might disappoint, it never ceased to teach.